Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel. We all hit bumps in the road, obstacles along our path, wherever it is that we want to go. But sometimes, no matter what we do, we can't seem to get around that big rock in the road. We hear all kinds of advice about it. We read all kinds of books. Maybe we even listen to podcasts, for what is ultimately some version of how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time. Now, I got to say, in many situations, if your mind is in the right place, that metaphor can work really well. You start with the small stuff, you take your time, and then sooner or later, poof, no more elephant. But what about when you're running a business? And try as you might, you just can't scale. You hit a certain point, there's that elephant. But it's either too big to handle on your own, or even worse, you can't even see it. It probably takes more than a management book or a podcast to set you right. Scaling a business past a certain point requires a whole nother level of leadership. But so many small business leaders have blind spots that prevent them from seeing what needs to be done. That's where my guest today comes in. She helps CEOs address those blind spots and gain the skills and insights they need to successfully scale or exit their business. An entrepreneur herself, she's also a former British Army officer with decades of experience dealing with leaders in the military, political, and business arenas. Now, as the leader whisperer, she's turned her deep understanding of management and leadership into programs that help small business owners and CEOs to become big business owners and CEOs. Please welcome to the show, all the way from the UK, my good friend, Carri Nicholson. Carri, good to see you.
Good to see you, Dan, and thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute blast to be here.
Yeah, I am. I've been waiting for this for a while, and I'll just give a little background for our audiences here, for our listeners. Folks have heard me talk about the Connective before, and so it's maybe not a surprise that we met through the Connective. Mm-hmm. And I think this is another great illustration of why that group really works, because the variety of amazing people that I've come across and that have connected with me and that have been just so generous with their time and their advice and their energy through that group makes me really have more and more faith in the value of connection with people. And, you, Carri, we connected months ago. We've had many conversations, finally leading up to today. I just want to thank the Connective, but I think, I think it's been a tremendous boon. And even, you're in the UK, so it's a global organization now. That's sort of how we got together. And I think we hit it off right away because, you have this leadership focus to your business, but your experiences and your depth of understanding of politics. And I know this is a no politics zone, but, I do like to talk me some politics outside the podcast. And, we've had a lot of great conversations in that direction. We've just come to know each other really well. So, I just want to give a shout out to the Connective and also just say, hey, the power of those human connections is something that we just can't underestimate.
Yeah. And it is just, it's not what you know. Well, some of it is what you know, but almost much of it is who you know and how to deepen the connections you have with people. Because people buy from people, and people want to be with people, and people work with people. So it's one of the things, just quick hobby horses, one of the things I always say is there's no such thing as B2B, and there's no such thing as B2C. It's P2P, people to people.
People to people. We always come up with these, long, and they get longer and longer, these models, which always end up in a C, that customer, consumer. I prefer the ones that end up in a P or an I, a person or an individual, because that's what it is. It always is. My favorite these days is I think Minter Dial. I don't know if he coined it, but he's another UK citizen or UK subject, as it were, and he said the term E to B to B to C, employee to business to consumer, right? And I kind of like that because it starts with a person and ends with a person. But it still misses that P and the P at the end, right? That remember, that's a person you're talking about, a human. And you're so right. It's always about that deepening that connection. And I think that your career or the life that you've led is just repeatedly that's come into play, and that's been like one of the reasons why you're the leader whisperer? Like obviously, I think a lot of folks who hear the whisperer, you automatically jump over to Cesar Millan, and I think I don't know if he was the first, like the whisperer, kind of.
I think the first was the horse whisperer.
The Horse Whisperer, yes, which was a novel, correct? But then Cesar Millan made it popular with with dogs and whatnot, and it's interesting when you say the leader whisperer, like you have a preternatural power over the people that you kind of work with, and can just kind of make great change happen with just by whispering a few things in their ear. And I know it is definitely not that easy. I want our people, our listeners to understand, but you do have this knack for those deepening those connections, and those that personal, uncovering those personal layers. I think that enable you to get to the heart of what is stalling folks in their in their growth and in their development. And that's what makes you the leader whisperer. But I want you to get into that a little bit. And if you can, just like, how did you get to be the leader whisperer? Like, I know it started, a while back. We talked about the Army, we talked about other things, but you had a really hell of a career getting up to this point.
Oh, I did. And I think probably the best way of describing it is I have done so many things over my life, and I've been lucky enough to be right place, right time, and put quite a lot of hard yards in, that I was actually told by a headhunter I was technically unemployable. And what that means is that I can't be put in a square peg. So the journey to where I am now actually started with a previous generation. And it started with my dad. And my dad, and it was an economist, practical economist working at Glasgow University. And he was really good at his stuff, and he had some very interesting ideas. And so he was hired by an organisation called Scottish Development Agency in 1976 to be employee number 3 and write the first business plan for them. And he ended up being director of projects and planning and head of inward investment for the whole of Scotland, and had an awesome time flying all over the world and meeting all these great people and saying, here, come and build your factory in Scotland. We'll give you lots of money, and we'll help train your staff and all the rest of that good stuff. But one of the things that really frustrated him is that every time he had to do a piece of work, he would need consultancy support him, because you had to have some objective outside activities. And he worked with Booz Allen, and he worked with McKinsey's, and he worked with Bain's, and he worked with Korn Ferry. And he kept thinking, I could have written that. And the reason he was working with all these brilliant businesses in the US was because nobody was doing it in the UK. So he took a very brave decision with absolutely zero contracts and a lot of faith. And he came out in 1984 and set up the UK's first economic development consultancy. And in 86, I went off to university. 85, I went off to university, graduated in 88 with a degree in business studies, marketing and psychology, and said, I'm never going to work for my parents. Fast forward 2 years, and I'd been working in the hospitality industry, working in some of the best country house hotels in the UK. And I could see what they were doing right, and I could see what could be done differently and better. And I knew if I was going to stay in that industry, what I really wanted to do was to have a place of my own and put those ideas into practice. Sadly, at the age of 22, nobody's going to bankroll you $3.5 million to go off and buy a hotel. So I came home, and my mom said, if you think you're sitting around doing nothing, you've got another thing coming. Your dad needs a PA. So I had a year apprenticeship where I sat in on every single meeting. I drove him to meetings. I heard him. I talked things over. I wasn't allowed to say anything at meetings and I proofread all the reports. I did all the data entries. I collected and collated questionnaires and surveys and all the rest of it. And at the end of the year, my dad said, I think you're about ready to cut your teeth, would you like to start as a junior consultant? Well, 3 years later, I was bringing in a third of the business to the practice. And I had my own stable of clients. And I really got into this thing about business creation and business growth and what it took, what conditions needed to be in place and what support could you give so that more people set up in businesses and more of those businesses survived. And our clients were regional development agencies and business support agencies all across the UK and also overseas. And one of the things that we were known for as a consultancy practice is that we didn't just leave them with a report having gone in and done a piece of work. So I used to say to all my clients, look, I've written you this program or I've written you this policy. Give me the first 6 businesses and I will take them through the program. So we can fine tune it, we can tweak it, we can make sure it works. I write it all up as documentation and manuals and guidebooks, and then I can hand it over to you and you can then run it with it, but we know it will work.
When you say give me the first 6 businesses, do you mean to run?
No.
As the CEO?
Not as the CEO. So to advise, to support, to work with the CEOs. So if we were doing, we did a big program called Options for Change, which was about business transformation and how you managed people better. And so I went off and wrote the program, and then I took 4 businesses through the program. So they understood they weren't having to do it by themselves. And I knew that the bits that I'd put together worked.
Yeah.
And so I was just very, very lucky because there weren't that many companies doing this, not just in the UK, but in Europe. We did a lot of work in Europe. We got involved in Poland, where we set up one of the first 4 centres for the promotion of entrepreneurship and business growth in Poland after the end of martial law. I set up and wrote all the documentation for and did all the training for the first 5 small business support programs in Poland. We ended up advising the Polish government on their inward investment strategy, which included taking the first 12 state-owned companies and doing the initial work with them so that they knew what they had to do and what they had to change so that they could attract private sector and Western European investment. Did the same and wrote the inward investment strategy for Scotland, and also the playbook for commercialisation of science and technology from universities. And yes, we also had I had a walk-on part in the Middle East peace process in the mid-90s.
Okay, hang on just a moment, because that's like burying the lead a little bit. I mean, the Middle East peace process in the 90s, obviously, I think, so many of our listeners, I'm assuming, were either just born around then or not born yet. I mean, but everybody's familiar with the fact that there has been an ongoing peace process. The 90s was, I think, was that post-Oslo you're talking about?
Just post-Oslo. So
just post-Oslo. Okay.
The discussions had been had, and there was top-level agreement that actually having a separate state of Palestine was going to be a good idea.
Yeah.
We were brought in, Fern Crichton Roberts and we partnered with a couple of other organisations, and we were brought in to facilitate the second level talks. So that is at within
like the deputy minister level?
Within government.
Yeah.
So we had to look at water, we had to look at education, we had to look at telecommunications, we had to look at, it was basically, if Palestine is going to become a separate state, what needs to happen and what support needs to be given from all the countries around it for that to work. Now, sadly, I never actually got to go out to, I did a lot of the research and a lot of the back office stuff and setting up the meetings and things like that. I was not actually allowed to facilitate because I'm a girl.
That old trope.
That old trope. I was in some eyes, I was a blonde under 30s girl, and that was just not going to be acceptable. So I did what I could to support it. And the really, really awful, tragic thing is we actually had agreement. We actually had pathways and routeways, and we knew exactly how it was going to work, and everybody had agreed. So that was Israel, that was Palestine, that was Lebanon, that was Syria, that was Jordan, that was Egypt. Everybody had agreed that this was going to happen. And then Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, and it all fell apart.
That was so, you were talking 93?
95.
Right? Was it 95? Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I remember now. I mean, I was in Japan at the time. I had been on Yitzhak Rabin's plane in 1987, I think. Like I was 15 years old, flying to Israel, and the plane was mysteriously delayed, and we had to spend 48 hours in London. We were kind of rerouted from Tel Aviv. And, it was the Sabbath, Shabbat in Israel, and so that we couldn't land. But then we found out later that what happened was Rabin was on the plane. He was defense minister at the time. There was a threat, probably, and they had to just divert. So I spent a lovely weekend in Heathrow.
What deep joy
at a hotel
for you.
There. It was great. Luckily it wasn't my first trip to England. So I knew that wasn't what the UK was about, but I was only 15. We had a good time, but that's amazing. You were so closely connected to that process. And, I guess the frustration at, not being able to get the effective outcome and the whole fact that you weren't included in the process, simply because you were not a man is an angle that we hadn't discussed before. That is, obviously, I don't think it would happen today. Maybe it would happen today with some of those partners.
I think with some of those partners, there might still be an issue.
Yeah.
You would like to think that there wouldn't be, but you never know.
Never know. Yeah.
I think also from a credibility and authenticity point of view, the 3 people who actually led the facilitation, with my dad leading the facilitators, they were all men in their mid-50s with a lot of experience under their belts.
Yeah.
And from a credibility point of view, actually I can see why you wouldn't want a gauche 25-year-old in the room.
Well, who knows? Had you been in the room, the outcome may have been different. We'll never know.
We will never know. But
we'll
yes,
never know,
it's my teeny, tiny little walk-on part.
It's incredible, the exposure that you've had to those players in the world. And I'm sure it absolutely has shaped you in some way to become the leader whisperer and where you are now. In parallel to that, though, like concurrently, what's this about being in the British Army? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah,
I mean,
when I was,
Commander Carri.
Commander Carri. Yeah, when I was in my final year at university, I discovered this thing called the OTC, the Officer Training Corps, and at the time, what actually attracted me was you got paid £23 a day, which when you're a broke student in your final year is quite attractive. And you got a £200 bounty for completing 5 tests every year. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'd always been a tomboy, and I'd always enjoyed that sort of thing. And my brother, by that point in time, my younger brother had joined the regular army. So he was off being a combat engineer. And so I went and joined this thing called the OTC. And stayed with it for nearly 20 years.
That's similar to the reserves.
It
here,
is.
right?
Well, the OTC stuff.
Yeah.
So the equivalent in the States is like the ROTC.
Right.
And so I had 3 years with that, and I got my commission. So I went to Sandhurst and was commissioned. Learned how to be a sniper, which was quite fun.
Goodness.
But what I actually did in the OTC was I was in armoured. We had little armoured cars. Armoured reconnaissance vehicles. So I drove and commanded armoured reconnaissance vehicles. And then I went and joined what at the time was called the Territorial Army, which is the reserves. And the role of the Territorial Army is not just to protect what's happening in the UK, but it's actually to backfill. So if there's a major deployment, then the TA gets mobilised. They go to fill roles that will then allow the regular army to fight. And there are certain units in the TA where there is no equivalent in the regular army, so you get called up anyway.
Right.
So, and I wanted to continue doing reconnaissance because I loved that. I'm fascinated. I was really playing spies. So I joined my local regiment and went off, and we were unusual. So the Scottish Yeomanry was a long-range reconnaissance unit, and they took me on, and I became the first woman in the British Army to be cat-badged to a cavalry regiment, regular or reserve. I beat the girl in the regular by 24 hours because I had a very determined colonel who was absolutely determined he was going to have the first. And somehow snuck under the radar because I was actually running a reconnaissance troop, which if we'd been mobilised, there's this thing about women not being allowed, women weren't allowed to fight on the front line. I wasn't going to be on the front line. I was going to be approximately 50 to 75 miles on the wrong side of it.
Whoa.
So our role would have actually been quite deep into enemy territory. And nobody twigged that. And one of the things that the army really did teach me is that even when you are in a position of command, you don't know everything. And I saw so many young officers fail because they assumed that having the rank gave them the knowledge. And I think the most valuable lesson I learned, and it was very early on in my career, not long after I was commissioned, was recognising the tone of voice of my troop sergeant when he would say to me, "Mum, are you sure you want to do that?" To which, if you're smart, the obvious answer is no, clearly I don't. What would you suggest I do instead?
Yes.
Because he'd been doing this for so much longer than I had.
Yeah.
And he had so much more knowledge and skills that the best thing I could do was learn from him.
Yeah. I think, I've spoken to a few, ex-military folks, some veterans, some combat, some non, and I know, I've known a few people who have been in, first responders and so on. And there seems to be a thread there when given command or when earning command, especially at a young age, that there's always that period of time where you think that the symbol that you have on your collar or on your shoulder, entitles you to just tell people what to do. And there is that, right? There are rules, but you're not going to make it very long in your space. So you're not going to ever get promoted. You're not going to move forward. You're not going to, but more than that, you're just not going to be successful in achieving your project objectives if you don't learn how to lead and don't learn fast.
And it's all absolutely all about people. And it's learning that respect has to be earned It's not a God-given right. And when people salute you, they are saluting the rank you carry on your shoulder. They're not saluting you as a person.
Yeah.
And one of the big changes that I saw in the way that the British Army did things is that when I first joined, it was micromanaged to the nth degree. So the instructions would be as tight as, okay, I want you to take that hill over there. I want 2 of you to go up the left-hand side, 2 of you go up the right-hand side, 4 of us will go up the middle. You won't start firing until you hear this whistle or whatever. And it really was right from the top, right from the very highest level, it was micromanaged right the way down. And then there was a sea change, and it was a massive sea change. And it became about trust, and it became about letting the people on the ground make the ultimate decisions because they were seeing what was really happening. And so all of a sudden, you would just be given your objective and you would be given the constraints. So instead of being, you will take that hill over there and this is how you're going to do it, it would be, we have an objective that needs to be reached by 10:00 tomorrow morning. The constraints that you have might be to do with fuel, it might be to do with personnel, it might be to do with ammunition, it could be a whole load of reasons. And you then had to go off and come up with a plan that would allow you weren't being told how to do it, it was just you got to do that, here are your constraints, you then had to come up with a plan that would allow you to do that. And so you learned to get really good at strategy and at trying to think. And at trying to think how the other side was going to think. And you learn to get really good at writing a plan and then having to defend it. And it, the further up the ranks I got, the bigger those plans got. And then ultimately in the early 2000s, I had a glorious 2 years as strategic planning officer for a logistics brigade. And that's a NATO-rolled logistics brigade. And we had 2,200 people, 1,900 vehicles, a port, and our own train set. And there were 3 of us in the plans team. And we had to plan all the moving of, it's like 9 regiments. Who was going to be where? How were they going to be resupplied? What was going, this is the objective we were given. We were going to have to resupply somebody else. How were we going to do that? And I had an absolutely awesome boss who every morning when we were on exercise, we would have to stand at the bird table, which is like the big map that shows this is where everything is happening. And he would hit us with, so what? So what, so what, so what, so what, so what? And only when he had no further questions to ask us and we could not answer them were we allowed to go off and implement.
That's incredible. Was that, and that you said that was a NATO role? So were you working, when you say there was 3 of you, were they 3 from the British Army or was it international force?
3 from the British Army. So we fitted within a NATO organisation. But we also had on and off. We had Australian Army and we had Canadian Army guys in there, and we had Americans. So sure. People came because we were the only specialist logistics brigade. People came in and out. So if you were a reserve officer from the States and you were working for a company based in the UK for a period of time, you would come and roll into us.
Interesting. I had just recently interviewed a gentleman by the name of Jim Benton, who was also a logistics commander within the U.S. Army, and he was a regular, so he wasn't in the reserves. He was in the Army for a while, but it's his kind of joy of logistics and of planning. He parlayed that ultimately into now that's his career. But it's interesting how the learnings that he had about leadership and about earning your leadership echoes exactly almost to the letter some of what you're saying. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, he's also keenly interested in understanding what leadership is all about and drawing those lessons out of people to figure out, what makes a great leader, or what makes somebody figure out their purpose and how to live towards their purpose. And I've just, it's anecdotal. I don't have a big data set, but I'm getting this trend that the leadership lessons that people learn in those organizations like the military, like the police, et cetera, I think you're learning through obviously it's life and death, right? It's on the line when you think it through all the way to the end. But it's a crucible.
It is.
You come out at the other end. Yeah.
But it's a crucible that's fascinating in all its facets. So even within the armed forces, one of my early clients, when I moved into this, doing mentoring formally as opposed to being something that I did, and I didn't even realize that was what I was doing. He was the first member of my Vistage Mastermind group, and he had been, amazing guy called John Tuckett. He had been captain of 2 submarines. Wow. So he'd had a nuclear submarine, an attack one, and he'd had a boomer, listening one. And one of the things that was fascinating talking to him is that in the submarine world, leadership is completely different.
Yeah.
Because you're in a metal tube for 3 to 6 months with a whole bunch of guys, and it becomes 100% about trust.
Yeah.
It's a completely different, and it's one of the reasons why submariners are kind of distrusted by the rest of the Navy.
Are they now?
Yes,
I didn't know
because
that.
They don't do this command and control thing. It's more like having conversations, and we don't have that.
Well, that's fascinating. I had the pleasure of working with an ex-submariner the U.S. side. He was the CEO of one of the subsidiary companies that I was with in my previous employer, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and he had told these stories about. Yeah, he was a chief, I think, on a submarine, on a nuclear sub during the height of the Cold War, and he talked about how they'd have to go under the polar ice caps and hide and wait things out, and you don't get more stressful situations than that, and that's why when he's as a leader, things just roll off him.
Yeah, because
right? Calm,
quite
cool.
frankly, there is nothing.
There's nothing
more stressful. So once but there is also, and it is thinking back to this whole idea of leadership and where this comes from. One of the things, if you look at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, which is where all British Army officers are trained, the logo, the writing underneath the crest says "Serve to Lead."
Like that.
And the book that every graduate of Sandhurst is handed is Viscount Slim's book on service leadership. So it's funny now when you hear so many leaders talking about service leadership and service leadership.
Yeah.
And you think, yeah, I know where that came from. And I'm immensely stoked that this is getting out into the wider world. But the whole concept of service leadership is if you don't support the people, it's this thing about flipping the triangle. So many leaders, when they start out, think of their business as being like a triangle with the pointy bit at the top and the flat bit at the bottom. And they're at the pointy bit at the top, and everybody else particularly the minions who are talking to people and doing that good stuff like selling and customer service, are at the bottom. And their job is to serve the person at the top. But if you've come from a service leadership point of view, you realize it's flipped. And your sole role as leader is to say to all the other people in the organization, what do you need and what can I do so you can be the best person in your job?
That's that's like along this theme of everything old is new again that I keep hearing, we keep experiencing these days. You live, I guess you start to live long enough and things go in circles and cycles. And it's not surprising that servant leadership, which, again, as you said, is very trendy, and people are talking about a lot now, has deeper roots. I do want to dig into that a little bit. And actually, this is a great way to kind of pivot into, the leader whisperer. So you had this terrific career in consulting, working with some major government players, private industry players, and so on. And it's fair to say that you've made a difference in the world in some ways. And then simultaneously, concurrently, you're running recon troops in the army. I mean,
oh yeah, I didn't have a proper holiday for about 8 years because I spent every weekend. 3 weekends out of 4 in green, and every piece of annual leave I had from the consultancy business, I was running around doing 18-hour working days. It's the sort of thing you can only do when you're young, single, and insane.
And thank goodness you did it. You have this wealth of knowledge and understanding. So now you bring it now into speaking with leaders or would-be leaders of all shapes and sizes, but you've come to focus in specific areas, and we'll get to that. I love this idea that so you had this real fascination with spycraft, with reconnaissance, with being behind enemy lines and getting into things from way back there. And I suppose that makes sense. Getting the the arse end view of what's going on of things, and being able to propose solutions from that angle. But then how working in becoming a leader, and then seeing how leaders develop through the military, through your private experience. It's just like, it seems like you've put those things together a little bit. And they've come to shape you, plus alpha. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit? How did you then sort of pivot to understand, first of all,
by
this
walking,
need?
Well, first of all, by walking in their shoes. Yeah. So when I met my first husband, he was not keen on me doing consulting. Had a number of conversations, you can imagine, with it being a family consulting business. And he wanted me to he was also in the TA. And in fact, we served together for a while, which was interesting. But he wanted me to be around more often and not to be globetrotting. So I set up my first business. And I went off and did something completely different, which is I went off and found houses for people.
Okay.
Particularly period houses, because I'd always had an interest in buying and restoring old houses. And I'd done one by myself and then one with my first husband. So people used to give me £3 million and I'd go off and buy them a house, which is fabulous. Buying houses with other people's money is absolutely awesome. Walking around and going, do you know what? I can't possibly bring my clients here. That wallpaper has got to go. It's just...
It sounds amazing. I mean, and having been in real estate at a time, basically getting a £3 million advance from my buyers would have been joyous. I will tell you, would have taken a lot out of that process.
So I did that for 5 years, and learned a lot about how not to run a business.
Yep.
And then I left my first husband, and I needed to find something to do. And it's an indication of what happens when you are in the insidious effect of an emotionally abusive and psychologically abusive relationship. I had advised governments I had done some amazing things, and I was applying for jobs at $16,000 a year as a secretary because I didn't think I was worth anything more than that, and nobody would actually hire me. So I went off and pivoted again because although the business was making money, it wasn't a steady amount. And I went off and spent 4 years working in universities.
And did you, sorry, like that, I don't want to just leave your recovery from being in an abusive relationship. I don't want to leave that on the table because I think there's obviously, there's certainly a lot there, but did you need were those 4 years at university your time to sort of recover, or was there anything you did to sort of suddenly to find yourself again?
Yeah, I met my second husband, and he acted as a therapist. This is the man I'm still married to. This is the man I've just heard walk in the door downstairs, and he was patient, and he has a massively high EQ, and he built me back up again. And so I then went off. So I had a year doing a fairly low-level job at a university. And then I went up and I got hired to run the MBA program at the University of Durham, which was at the time one of the top 40 global MBA programs. So I didn't do any teaching, although I was promised they wanted me to do teaching, and then it turned out they didn't want me to do teaching. But what I did was make it happen. So that was fabulous because I had the full-time MBA, the part-time MBA, Caribbean and Chinese. And it was that logistics thing again, making sure everything happened on time, making sure that lecturers got hit with tasers so they actually did marking. I was the first MBA program manager to actually be given control of the budget, which was brilliant. Yeah. And made a £200,000 saving in our first year. Just because we could do things more efficiently.
And this is coming from someone who had just very, recently before that had a lack of confidence due to the relationship you were in. And now here you are building yourself back up, running a massive department, saving money, chalking up some wins.
And what actually happened is that because I was the first person to come into that post who'd come from a business background rather than an academic administration background, all my students used to come and talk to me.
Imagine
and it was me that they wanted to talk about what they were going to do when they when they finished their program, what they should be doing in terms of their thesis. What type of things were they interested in? And it was pretty much an open door. And they knew that I had a coffee maker and some comfy chairs. And in hindsight, funnily enough, I was actually talking to one of them on LinkedIn, talking in inverted commas to one of them on LinkedIn,
sure.
Only the other day, saying, I realize now that actually I was honing my craft as a mentor then.
Yeah.
Because you guys just wanted to talk to me. And you wanted to, because I didn't have an academic view of the way business worked. And so that was really, really fascinating. And I had 3 cohorts that I in the full-time MBA who were my bairns. They were actually, most of them were probably not that much younger than me, but it felt like they were my bairns. And then I left the university and I went off to go and run. And this was my first, technically the job title was project manager. In fact, it was CEO of the Red Squirrel Conservation Programme for the UK. And that was amazing. 9 full-time members of staff, 500 plus volunteers, huge amounts of press coverage, and we picked up the Prince. Literally the day I came back off maternity leave, and I was only on maternity leave for 2.5 months. The day I came back from maternity leave, I was called in by the head of the organisation that I worked with, to say, would you like to call this woman called Elizabeth Buchanan? And I said, why?
Mm-hmm.
Who is she? You know, he just hit me on my first day. And he was like, she's the Prince of Wales's personal secretary. And she would like to talk to you because the Prince of Wales would like to work with you.
Interesting. I'm sure you refused that right out.
I refused that right out.
No, thank you.
So I had a very nerve-wracking one day. You know, I hadn't even got my feet under the table. I had no idea what had been happening in my absence. And I had to call this very formidable but ultimately absolutely amazing woman and have what was the first of many conversations about red squirrel conservation, which is one of the His Majesty's personal passions.
Still, is the king still a red squirrel?
Oh, I would be
supporter?
Extremely surprised. You don't change that sort of thing. He actually made a film about it in 2018.
Oh, so very recent. Okay.
His house in Birk Hall in Scotland, where he leaves his study door open and has a basket of hazelnuts always on the fireplace so that the red squirrels can come in and get hazelnuts and run around his study and go out again.
These are the kind of touching vignettes that would have, had they been more widely spread, probably helped a little bit in reputational issues with previous reputational issues with the king. But,
he is an amazing man.
Yeah.
He helped us financially at a very, very generous personal donation. And then he got his private secretary and I, Elizabeth, and I worked together, and we ended up, he hosted a private dinner at Clarence House for 26 of the wealthiest individuals in the UK to bring them on board to red squirrel conservation and get them to dig deep into their pockets.
Terrific.
And I had to go out and buy a dress. It was awesome. It's one of the highlights.
It's a great story. Wow. And so you've hobnobbed with the leaders that anybody would ever want to hobnob with. And I mean, it just seems that you've, by rubbing elbows, but, we're not talking about just putting on a dress and going to a party. This is a cause that you worked for. It
was 9 months.
You were able to secure donations,
9 months in the planning, and a lot of sitting down and putting feelers out as to who were the right people to get involved, who would make a difference if we brought them on board. So one of the people that we got there one of the couples we got there were Mark and Maggie Fenwick. Mark's family have one of the oldest independent department stores in the UK. Mm-hmm. But Mark never wanted to do that. Mark was a music producer and a music agent, and his clients include Roger Waters and T-Rex. He managed T-Rex. He still manages Roger Waters, and he manages Brian Ferry.
Okay, those are names.
Those are names.
Those are names.
And I kind of didn't. I kind of thought I knew this, and then we because he said he knew I was the reason that he was at Clarence House, and he was really pleased about that. And he and Maggie and I just talked. And so he was telling me all these stories over champagne and canapes, and it was like, oh, God.
Where am I?
So that was, and the reason at that point in time, it was a really hard place to be. It was a hard place to be as a woman. I had a board of 57 and 57 interest groups that were at each other's throats. In fact, there was one board meeting we had when I actually had to physically separate people
Goodness.
And
were they aware that you had commanded
they didn't care.
A battalion by the
They
point?
didn't care. I was still a girl, and I was from business, not from conservation. So what did I know? The fact that the Heritage Lottery Fund told me it was the most successful project that they'd ever funded, with massive amounts of press coverage, didn't matter. But it was the loneliest place, and my stress levels were, over 6 years, were phenomenal. And it was really scary. And there was nobody that I could turn to. And nobody I could bounce decisions off who did not have a vested interest in the outcome of those decisions. And it was one of the things that I think drove me when I became the leader whisperer. And by the way, I didn't pick that name. That was a client gave that name to me. Absolutely awesome. And yes, it is trademarked. Was I did not ever want any other CEO or business owner to be in those shoes.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of move now in that direction with the leader whisperer. Now that you've talked about these formative events in your life, and I know there's more. I think that you've got this. Well, first of all, bringing all these forces together and building these, being the outsider, let's say, in an organization, and coming forward and taking it in directions that this is a repeated kind of pattern in your life. And now you come to this point where you're going to become the leader whisperer, let's say, but you're thinking about how you're going to mentor people. How are you going to, how did this idea come to you? How did you just decide, okay, here's what I want to do. I'm going to, help this particular group of people to do this particular thing.
It came about because I hit a crossroads in 2016 for all sorts of reasons. And my second attempt at business was doing really well. And then we had the 2015 election, and everything stopped because businesses were our kind of business doing our kind of thing. And I'd gone back into economic development, was too small. And that was when I thought, really need to get a proper job. And I talked to the headhunters, and that was when I was told I was technically unemployable. And one of them said, however, all the stuff that you've done means that you have a very unusual take on the support that leaders need. There is this organisation called Vistage. Have you ever heard of it? And I was like, no. And they explained to me what it was, that it was about creating mastermind groups for business leaders where they have a safe space that they can talk about the stuff that really is challenging them, and they can ask for help. And because you have a wide collection of experiences and backgrounds and sectors in the room, the perceptions that you get and the assistance that you get is going to be much more interesting and useful than if it was just somebody with one sectoral background. Yeah. So when I discovered this, it was like, why didn't I know about it? Vistage was like the best kept secret you'd never heard of. And it was like, I wish I'd known about this when I'd been a CEO, because this would have absolutely transformed my experience if I'd been part of a group like that. So I had 3 years of running Vistage mastermind groups. And one of the joys of that is not just the mastermind group sessions themselves, which are fascinating. You are the circus ringmaster. You've got to make sure that everybody is heard, everybody's listened to, everybody's perceptions are taken into account, and you're also holding all of them accountable for the changes that they've agreed to make. But you also have one-to-ones. And I've had thousands of hours of one-to-ones. And looking back over my life, I mean, like literally thousands. I've worked with probably close on 1,000 businesses now of all sizes, from multi-billion-dollar, multinational, multi-site organizations down to solopreneurs with big ideas and big dreams and pre-revenue. And what I was hearing is that the problems come up again and again and again. And so what I love in the one-to-ones is getting that intimate understanding of a business from a leader's perspective. And they talk to you because you're the first person they can talk to who is not going to judge them. That they can be vulnerable with, they can be scared with, they can say, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. And the difference between a coach and a mentor is the coach does the, so tell me, how do you feel about this? The mentor rolls their sleeves up and goes, okay, what do we need to do practically to make the changes? And that went right back full circle to the way that I used to be a consultant, where it wasn't just the theory. Here is your KPMG report, which is going to sit on the shelves for 12 years and you'll do nothing with because you don't know what to do with it. I liked doing the, how do we make this work?
So more consultative than coaching is the way, if you think about it that way.
Yes, it's still coaching in that you are still there as their, probably confidant is a better word to coach.
Yeah.
And because it's about the whole person, nothing is off limits. Absolutely nothing is off limits, because if bad things are happening at home, it absolutely, I do not believe, hand on heart, and I've seen this, there is no such thing as a business hat and a home hat. If bad stuff is happening at home, it absolutely affects your judgment and your ability to make good decisions.
Couldn't agree more. It's something I've learned. There's always a debate about, bringing your whole self or your authentic self or your whatever self to work. And I've always had issues with this simply because it implies that there's another self. It implies that you are somewhere you're disingenuous. If you have to bring your authentic self somewhere, that means somewhere you're not being authentic, or it means that you're not being genuine.
It's public face.
Well, that's a cultural thing for sure,
which is a cultural thing, but
which makes sense.
But in actual fact, it's this. But it's also the same thing the other way around. If things are not working in your business, your family and your other half is the first person who feels the brunt of it. Guilty as charged.
Sure.
And it's so giving leaders a safe space where they can be themselves, and they don't have to be, everything is fine, everything is calm, we're going to get through this. Giving them a space where they can say, I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. Yeah. And I've had things like one of my clients nearly lost their three-year-old son in a drowning accident. Lord. And that was that was unfortunately he's an absolute miracle, and he survived and literally brought back from the dead. But the fallout personally from that, and just being there and letting him talk, because there was nowhere else he could do that.
So valuable to have that space. And that's what you do now. That's what I do now for your clients.
But more than that, what I've actually realized is, if I look back at all the businesses and all the leaders that I've worked with, 80% of them, and I don't know why this is, but 80% of them have a background that is STEM: science, technology, engineering, maths.
So, yeah, I was going to ask about that because I know that is something that's sort of your focus area. If there were, I know that you work with people outside of that space, but you have a particular, specialty working with people with that background, and it just came about organically.
It came about actually. Somebody challenged me because I'd always said I work with leaders. It doesn't matter the size of business. I've worked in every single vertical except mineral extraction. And then somebody challenged me and said, that's not niching. You're still speaking to everybody out there. Yeah. I went, STEM, maybe. And they kept pushing me.
Yeah.
And it was a really great coaching session from somebody coaching me from my point of view. And I came off the session and it was like this spark had gone off in my head. Because I suddenly realized, why am I going STEM? Actually, about 80% of my clients have had a STEM background. And the more I thought about it, I thought, you know what? And the same things keep coming up. They keep coming up in consulting. They keep coming up in one-to-ones. They kept coming up in group conversations. And I realized that these are blind spots that people and it's not their fault. That's just how their minds work and how all the training that they've had that's brought them to the point where they've founded or they are CEO of a STEM business or they have a STEM background means that they may have a niggling understanding that these things are holding them back, but they don't actually understand the extent to which, and they certainly don't know how to deal with them. And until they know those things, accept them and work out what that means for them and what they personally as an individual need to do to get over that to get past that blind spot, they're not going to be able to scale their business.
So after hundreds, thousands of hours with people, 80% of whom happen to be in STEM, you've come up with, or you've drawn out patterns that you see that you've distilled into these blind spots. And, I know that we have talked about this before, so I know that the answer is 12.
The answer is 12.
How many blind spots are there? There's 12. I would like to, if we could just quickly go through those because, it's so, first of all, it's fascinating, but second of all, it's like, it's something that you've created. And I think that it has a wider application from beyond STEM and beyond even the business building era. So area.
I think it does. Briefly, if we go around, if you think of it like a wheel, and you can step on the wheel wherever you like. But if we start with one of the key ones is doing thinking and planning. So for people with that background, creating and executing is really easy. What they find really difficult is thinking long term and actually doing the strategizing. And so that is always now, not what if. Another one that I know is, and when I say it to clients, they go, oh yeah, that's me. They are a world-class problem solver for other people. But because they are caught up in the middle of things, they find it very difficult to see and fix the problems within their own business.
A Dr. Heal Thyself type of a situation.
They tend to focus on the micro, particularly in the early stages. It's like MVP. And actually, quite often have not sat down to think about what does this mean in the bigger scheme of things.
It's fascinating.
There's a real thing about perfectionism and the whole ethos. If you've come from a STEM background, you are taught, and you've been drawn into that because of your personality types, you are taught that perfection is everything. What that actually means is that can lead to procrastination, because you are constantly in search of the ideal rather than the good enough, and you put off making decisions because of that. Mm-hmm. You see the world differently. I have a number of clients who are genuinely visionary, and what they do is going to change the world. But where I have to spend time with them is this what the world actually needs rather than what the world wants? And sometimes, does the world want this? You think the world needs this. Does the world actually want this? There's a disconnect there. They also, because of that and because of their training, they are not comfortable at working outside their comfort zones.
Yeah.
So anything that is outside their direct knowledge and experience is very scary to them. That leads on to this thing about being peas in a pod. They assume that everybody thinks and behaves as the same way that they do.
That's such an interesting one. First of all, so far, everything you said almost, I feel like, oh, that applies to me sometimes. And certainly when I think about, perfectionism, I have the opposite problem where I don't think about the MVP all the time, but I do get a paralysis, that analysis paralysis that just sometimes it's like, well, I know we need to write this piece and I'm going to just keep pushing it off because it's going to be hard to get it right.
Yes.
When I have to step in and stop myself and say, look, it's organic. We have to just get it out there and we will, nothing's ever going to be perfect. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. It has to be a mantra in my head sometimes.
Oh, as my husband says, I used to be the person who could take 3 hours to write an email.
Yes, I was the same. That's exactly right. But
the peas in the pod.
Peas in the pod. That one, we all I think it's so hard to learn how to step outside yourself and understand that your worldview is not the worldview.
And
it's a worldview.
STEM leaders, because a lot of their early hires are techies, they do kind of all think the same.
It's that bubble thinking, right? It's like living in a bubble.
What it means is that the number of times when I've had clients who have got so frustrated with particular members of their staff. And it's not that particular person is a bad person, nor is it that they are doing bad things, but they're not behaving in the way that my client would be behaving if he were doing that. And you have to step back and go, no, they do not think, not everybody thinks. In fact, an awful lot of people don't think and behave the way you do. And you have to learn to step back, because that also fits these three bits. There's a peas in the pod. There's there's something about EQ.
Right.
The managing people means managing their emotions and behaviors. And that is something that STEM leaders can find very, very challenging. And what that means is that they struggle to build functional teams.
Yeah.
And linked into that is a communication thing. Understanding how people communicate and how to communicate your particular values and your ethos and the behaviors that you expect to see happen. And so there's a whole quadrant on the wheel, which is about understanding that you can build teams a better way, and they don't have to be dysfunctional. But if you don't get that team building right, and you don't learn how to talk to people, and you don't learn how to use the language that will best motivate them, then you will get to a certain point and you will stop, and you will never be able to grow. Because above that, is the ability to hire non-technical staff. The bits that will actually grow the business, like sales and marketing.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what you're looking for. You don't know what good looks like. You're hiring salespeople who, quite frankly, are very good at selling things like themselves.
Yes.
You have no idea how to motivate them. You have no idea what KPIs to set them. You set them things like, just sell me so many units, or sell me, I'm looking for X amount of revenue. And I'm going to pay you a really good salary, which means you've got a salesperson who's not motivated because they are motivated by the win. You've paid them basically to do nothing. And the way that they will get their revenue targets is they will just discount the hell out of things. And you wonder why you're not making profit. And the reason is you're not set the right targets.
And there's also a huge cultural fit issue here, because I think that's a mistake. Not only that small business owners, like departments, line managers, hiring managers everywhere make this mistake where they think, I just want a shit hot salesperson. I want somebody who's going to come in and sell. And even if the incentive structure is right, there's that cultural piece that that's where the EQ, the peas in a pod,
the communication,
the ability to communicate, so critically important. I mean, when you're a small business owner growing a business, you're going to have your hands into a lot of these things yourself.
Yes.
So you need to get your handle around that. But even as you grow the business, you have to build that culture into it so that the people that you do hire can continue on and avoid those blind spots.
Because I've not met a business owner yet. Now, maybe I've just been lucky, but I've not met a business owner yet who has actively set out to create a toxic culture in their organization.
Oh, right.
I've met an awful lot of business leaders who are leading a toxic culture and don't even know about it. They don't realize, they just think that they're never hiring the right people. So they have a revolving door of staff, and productivity is down and customer complaints are up. And they don't realize that culture starts at the top and trickles down. Yeah. And if you don't set your values and your ethos out clearly, and more importantly, if you don't then hire and reward on the behaviors that make those values come to light, then you're going to have staff that are constantly not fitting in because you're not hiring for the right reasons.
1000% agree. That reflects, I've been in those kind of startup-y environments where you hire people because they think like you, or where the CEO is hiring people who are like, also startup guys,
or startup guys,
women,
or they went to the same college, or they have mutual friends, or
right. There may be a little trust there, right? So someone who is like me, I can trust them more easily, but that is long run a mistake.
Here is an example of this that has massive ramifications across the business world.
Sure.
How venture capital companies hire partners. You end up with panels of people who all look the same. White, male, under 40. And they give the money to white, male, and under 40. They give money to people who look like them. So what that means is that if you're a female founder, or if you're a person of color as a founder, the chances of sadly, if you are a black founder, and even worse, if you're a black female founder, the chances of you getting venture capital funding is about 2%.
Goodness.
This is not because the ideas are rubbish. This is not because the business is rubbish. This is because you don't look like the people who are giving you money. And that has huge implications right the way across the business infrastructure. How many awesome businesses that could be world beaters never get off the ground because the hiring decisions inside the people who make the money decisions are not diverse.
I'm starting to get a little optimistic about this now, though, to be honest with you. Like,
it is changing.
Because we're mindful of it now. Like, people are watching this and making says that the pendulum tends to swing too, so you go too far in one direction.
It's taken a bloody long time. I was writing about this in 1996.
Yeah. Well, forces had to converge and be right for this,
did.
right?
And it is getting better, but it's still a long way to go.
Sure.
So the final two things I'd just like to talk about on the wheel are...
Let's do it.
And this is not unique to STEM founders, but it affects them more than anything else. They get stuck in the whirlwind. They absolutely have far too much time, because it's their comfort zone. Far too much time is eaten up by day-to-day operations and actually delivery. And when things start going wrong, their answer to it is to put more and more hours in.
Working in the business?
Working in the business, not on the business, working in the business at nighttime, working in the business at weekends, never getting to go and see their kids' sports day. Kids are saying, who is that person over there, daddy or mummy? I have no idea. I very rarely see them. Not taking holidays or working every single holiday. And the divorce rates in founder businesses are ridiculously high, because at some point in time, the person who's providing all the support at home to make this happen goes, I've had enough. I don't know you anymore. You're not the person I married. And at the same time, one of the reasons that when they get stuck in the whirlwind, the final piece in the jigsaw is the inability it's the theory versus practice. So I find a lot of my clients, until they started working with me, are almost drowning in leadership and business books. They've listened to every podcast. They've read so many books, many of which are conflicting. They've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to snake oil salesmen who say, do what I do exactly the way that I do it, and you too will 10 times your business. No, they won't, because they're not you. And their business is not your business. And what it means is that they've got a grounding in theory, which is quite often conflicting theory. But because they're so caught in the whirlwind, they have no ability to step back and go, what does this actually mean for me? What does this mean for my business? Is this latest business book, is this even important?
So it's that critical thinking and
how
analysis.
How do I make this work? What do I need? If this is important, if this is something that's really sparked me and I want to implement this, how do I practically make that happen for my unique business?
It's interesting that there are so many people, I think, out there who are grasping for that help in a book, or who do go for the bright, shiny object. I'm guilty of this sometimes. Less so with books, but more so with things I'll see or hear, or very persuasive people, much to the consternation of my wife. But you hear about, you have particular problems. You may not be aware of them on the surface, but then, you get served up, or you see the book that's going to change your life, or the gadget that's going to do it. And you go for it. And if you're running a business and you're thinking, gosh, revenue's slow, and you see things like build the perfect funnel, right? Let's this is your problem. Let's get your funnel right up. And here's 175 different templates for funnels that will guarantee 10x, 15x, 18x to business, et cetera. Doesn't tell you that, each 90% of the time these funnels are going to alienate most of your customers, or this funnel is really made for somebody who's going to have like a pop-up shop on Shopify and be able to walk away, or what are the reputational issues? There's so many different things that you just don't know. So you need to have that critical thinking take a breath and listen to things and read things with that. And sometimes and oftentimes it's hard to do if you're in the whirlwind, as you say, right? How do you have the space to process?
It is one of the things I do with all my clients is whether they're in a mastermind group, whether they're on a one-to-one program with me, they get homework. And the homework is not onerous. So I used to, once upon a time, I used to say, go and read this book because this book will change your life. Or go and listen to this book. And then I realized that actually very few CEOs and very few business founders can spend 15 hours listening to Ray Dalio's Principles, which is an awesome book. But my goodness, it's long.
It's right behind me.
So you know it's a big read. It's an intensive read. And then I discovered that there is a brilliant website which has produced 8-minute abstracts with the author's permission of all the best bits from these books.
Oh.
Am I allowed to mention it, or is this advertising?
Of course. It's my show.
It's called getabstracts.com.
Getabstracts.com. All right, we'll put that in the notes.
It's
getabstracts.com.
It's about £200 a year, $228, I think it is a year. And it's got virtually every business book you could think of.
Oh.
And you can download them to your Kindle. You can download them as a PDF. You can download them as an MP3. And I give those to my clients now and say, this is only 8 minutes. If it sparks, then you can go off and get the full version.
Read the book.
But really, everything you need to know to get going is in that. Go off and read it. And then the next meeting that we have, we're going to talk about what that means for you, because I've given it to you for a reason, what that means for you and what that means for your business. And if, for example, one of the books I'm a big fan of is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Patrick Lencioni, because dysfunctional teams is one of the big problems that STEM founders have. And because it's told as a fable, it's a really easy read. And so you can then have a conversation with them about, if you look at the 5 dysfunctions in the book, how many of those are present in your senior leadership team? What do we need to do to change the dynamic there so that your team becomes more functional?
So it's so important to get even having that advice about where to start your research or your getting that external, because you could go nuts looking for books and looking for hearing about all this kind of stuff. I do, and I
do as well. Guilty as charged, Your Honor. But I spent a long time, probably about 3 years, working out which were the ones that, by talking to clients and talking to other successful business people and talking to other coaches, which are the ones that have the biggest impact.
Sure. I found that my certainly many of my podcast guests, but also some of my friends who are successful coaches or successful advisors, or they're always a great source for that, for what book I should read next, or what I need to do. Obviously, the people who are coming on my show and have written a book, those are the ones I read.
It would be rude not to.
Want to make sure. I would be rude not to. But I am I'm always very grateful for a shortcut, not necessarily an abstract, but so that I can, zero in on the ones that I should be looking at.
If you go and have a play with Get Abstract, the joy about that is you can actually search on keywords, and you can build up your own library. I will certainly check it out. So if you're just looking at leadership, it will actually, the more you use it, the algorithms will suggest other books that you should look at. And you get a weekly digest that says, this is a book that we're recommending, and this is an abstract we're recommending for you. And by the way, these are the top 5 books that are currently trending in the system.
Very useful, and I'm going to subscribe, or I'll check it out. I don't know if I'm going to pay for that, to be honest with you. But still, I have lots of.
This is one where
it's too easy.
This is one where, quite frankly, your company should be paying for it, because it is an absolutely awesome resource for anybody. Because it's literally anything you can think of: HR, marketing, sales, leadership, you name it, operations. The abstracts are in there, but they also have them for journals and for newspaper articles.
Whew. I have a lot of homework.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that later.
Get abstracts, and thank you.
And that's the other thing, is the accountability. Because very few leaders have, it's not just giving them the safe pair of ears. It's also saying, I care enough about you to follow up on this, and I'm not going to let this lie. Right.
Integrity comes out of that trust. It all comes back again. And just to bring us full circle almost, it's about that human connection. And, creating those connections, that person, that P, that it's not B2B, it's P2P, not to be confused with peer-to-peer. It is that person-to-person touch. And, ultimately that does come down to being a person of your word. And I think that all things, put everything else together, if you ultimately in the end do what you say you're going to do, provide the service that you promise that you're going to provide, keep your promises, like just the things that you're taught when you're 3-4 years old, never break a promise. Those are really important things. And I mean, even earlier than that, 2 years, those hold true, truer than most things. And, of course, I'm a communicator, storyteller, PR guy. And I keep thinking about, what reputation means and what trust means in the context of not only my company and my employer, but also me as a person, my personal brand. And I don't think there's anything more valuable than that. And there's no amount of investment that is too much for your own, to maintain your own reputation. And it sounds like that is what accountability kind of is ultimately ladders up to.
It is. It's committing to first of all, it's committing to take action, but it's then saying, and I'm no longer going to promise to do something and not do it.
Yeah.
And in the groups, yes, it does occasionally mean a little bit of mild public ribbing. And, you promised you were going to do this. Have you actually done it? What's your excuse this time?
Naming and shaming always works.
Also, there's that thing. If you're in a mastermind group, if you've made a public commitment to the group are going to call you out on it. And if you don't do it, they want to know why. Because what's the backstory? What's been the hold up this time? And trust me, if you get somebody who keeps bringing the same problem to the group and they don't take action to solve it, they leave the group very rapidly. They're using it as a place to vent, but not to actually do anything about it. And that kind of personality just brings people down.
It's not good for the group. It's not good for the group. And again, it's a person-to-person thing. You're betraying the relationships that you promised you're going to uphold.
Yeah,
you're not adding value. I think that's probably a really good place for us to wind this down. And I can't believe it. This may be my longest show. I mean, we've been talking for a long time. I've been so enjoying to hear about your journey. I was under no illusions that we would have a short conversation. I just thought that, that I wanted to hear your story. It's so fascinating. You've done us all such great justice by, kind of exploring those, how you came to understand leadership and how you came to understand the way that leaders think, but also that in particular STEM leaders, people with a STEM background think. But I think that honestly, your insights are applicable across the boards. And I can't wait for this episode to come out, because I think that people will really understand, especially as they get through those qualities or those blind spots that plague the leaders that you work with. We're going to see a lot of ourselves in those. And I think that's something that we all need to work on. And I know that you have loads and loads of solutions for those things. So I want to encourage anyone who's out there listening and who is looking to scale their business or even wants to have a chat about these issues, to please reach out to Carri. Her name is going to be spelled properly in the episode title. You can look for her on LinkedIn, or you can also check her out on, I think, are you active on Twitter, Carri? I know you have Carri Nicholson on Twitter. And
I have Carri Nicholson on Twitter. I tend to use Twitter to amplify LinkedIn. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. And I am the only leader whisperer. So I'm fairly easy to track down. The
Leader Whisperer, just look for the Leader Whisperer. CarriNicholson.com is also active. There's any number of ways, but, just reach out directly on LinkedIn, find the Leader Whisperer, and talk to Carri. She's extremely interesting. We've had a great conversation, and I think there's so much more to talk about. I want to reserve the right to bring you back on at some point if you're up for that. I assume that you are.
I am always up for that.
Any last words then, Carri, that you want to impart some wisdom?
Yeah. Don't beat yourself up, guys, because to get as far, any leader to even survive a year is beating the odds. All you need is the boost to get to the next level. But you can't do that by yourself. So if it's not me, find somebody.
Yeah.
Because everybody needs somebody in their corner.
I could not have said it better myself, and of course I didn't. So you heard it here, folks. Listen to the Leader Whisperer when you get a chance. Reach out to Carri. And Carri, thanks so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me.
You got it.
All right, thanks for listening to The Dan Nessel Show. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. People always ask me, why do I do the show? I do it for the ratings. I do it for your validation. So do me a favor. Go over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or someplace else, wherever you're listening to podcasts, and subscribe, leave a review, rate me, and share with your friends. Anything you can do to spread the word, I deeply appreciate it. Thanks again for listening to The Dan Nessel Show.